Nowhere to Call Home by Cynthia DeFelice. Chapter 2. Frances lay in bed, still groggy from sleep, watching the raindrops pelt the window pane. What a dreadful dream she had had! Gazing at the clock, she saw that its hands read several minutes after 11. Mary had not come at 7:30 as usual, to wake her and draw her bath. Bridget had not brought her breakfast tray. She was late for her lessons with Miss Chenier, the governess. Father would be furious. Then she remembered. It was no dream. Father was dead. But that wasn't possible. How could Father be dead? Father who walked to his office and back each day to maintain his health. Father who insisted that Bridget cook only nutritious foods and no sweets. Father who fairly bristled with strength and vigor. She expected that at any moment he would walk through the door and say in his booming voice, "What are you doing lying about in bed? Haven't you anything better to do?" Father's orders kept everyone in motion, Frances and the servants. He couldn't be dead, not Father, or everything would stop. With a sick feeling, she listened to the quiet house. Everything had stopped. Suddenly, she felt frightened. She got out of bed quickly, got dressed, and ventured downstairs. There was no one about. Finally, drawn by the sound of voices, she crept to the kitchen, where she found the servants gathered in somber conversation. Frances stood awkwardly at the door. "Good morning," she said uncertainly. "Good morning, miss," a chorus of voices answered. Bridget hurried to the stove and began spooning biscuit batter onto a large baking sheet. Mary gave Frances a look filled with sympathy. Junius came right over to her and placed his brown, weathered hand on her shoulder. Gordon and Miss Bailey looked uncomfortable standing about in the kitchen. Frances thought she knew how they felt. They were used to answering to Father. Now that he was gone, no one quite knew what to do, least of all Frances. Gordon cleared his throat and spoke. "I've telephoned your Aunt Bushnell, Miss Frances. I expect she'll let us know her wishes." "Aunt Bushnell?" Frances repeated. "But why?" Bushnell Barrow Hill was her father's widowed sister who lived far away, in Chicago. "She's your only living relative, miss." "But you sit down now, Miss Frankie," said Junius, "and Bridget will fix you some breakfast." He led Frances over to the big kitchen table, sat right next to her on the bench, and poured her a glass of juice. "But it's almost lunchtime," Frances said. "Where's Miss Chenier?" "I phoned and told her not to come today," answered Miss Bailey. It seemed best, all things considered. Her voice drifted off and stopped. "Will she come tomorrow?" Frances asked. Her question was met with silence. Bridget busied herself whisking eggs and pouring them into a frying pan, and the others avoided Frances's gaze. Finally Gordon said, "We don't know, miss. Your aunt is making the arrangements. She said she'd have to speak to the bank, and that they would send someone over today to tell us what has been decided." "Who is deciding?" asked Frances, confused. "And what are they deciding?" "We'll have to wait and see, Miss Frankie," Junius said soothingly. "Now you eat something." Frances picked at her food. In spite of the late hour, she felt no hunger, just an unsettled churning in the pit of her stomach. Bridget was washing the dishes when the doorbell rang. Frances jumped up from the table and accompanied Gordon to the door, where he admitted a tall, well-dressed gentleman. The gentleman introduced himself as Cleveland Fletcher, lawyer for the bank. Mr. Fletcher told Gordon to assemble the other servants in the drawing room. Turning to Frances, he said, "And you must be Frances. I'm sorry for your loss. I've been in contact with your aunt. She's speaking with the people at the funeral parlor and asked me to tell you that in light of the circumstances, there will be no service. She's arranged for you to take the early train to Chicago tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Frances blurted, stunned. But Gordon appeared in the foyer to say that the servants were ready. Frances followed the men down the hallway to the drawing room and listened, dazed, as Mr. Fletcher announced that the house and its contents were being sold to cover her father's debts. He informed the servants that they were to leave on Friday, when they would receive their final wages. Silence filled the room. Miss Bailey spoke first. "But where will we go, sir?" Mr. Fletcher looked startled, then annoyed. "Why, home, I suppose," he said. "But, sir," said Mrs. Bailey, her voice tight, "this is my home. I have no other, nor do the rest." "Have you no families to take you in?" asked Mr. Fletcher. "No, sir," said Gordon. "Miss Bridget's family is in Ireland. Miss Bailey is a widow, alone in the world as I am. Miss Mary was put into service because her family is too poor to keep her. Mr. Junius Washington has lived in this house longer than Mr. Barrow himself." "Humph." Mr. Fletcher reflected for a moment. "Well, there's nothing to be done about it. You can't stay here. At least you'll have a roof over your heads for a few more days until you get settled somewhere." "But where, sir?" Bridget's question was a wail. It hung in the air for a long moment. Finally Gordon said, "No one is hiring servants in this depression, sir. People everywhere are out of work." "Men who once was millionaires are selling apples in the street," added Junius. Mr. Fletcher sighed and said quietly, "I know that. I'm sorry. I have my orders from the bank." He turned to Frances. "I understand your care will fall to your aunt now. You're lucky to have a relative to take you in. Do you realize that?" Frances nodded dumbly. She didn't feel lucky, not the least bit. Mr. Fletcher continued speaking. You'll need to pack up the things you want to take to your aunt's house. Just your clothing and personal items, mind you. Everything else will be sold. Do you understand? Yes, Frances whispered, although the only thing she understood was that her life was changing too fast. She had never lived anywhere but in this house with her father, and now she had to leave it for her aunts. It felt all wrong. She scarcely knew Aunt Bushnell, who had come to Philadelphia just once for a visit. All Frances could recall was her aunt's direct blue eyes and penetrating gaze. Once she had overheard a conversation between her father and her aunt, in which Aunt Bushnell told father that she was concerned about Frances growing up without a mother. Frances didn't understand what the fuss was about. Her mother had died when Frances was very young, and Frances didn't remember her at all. She wondered about her mother sometimes, but how could she miss what she had never known? For as long as Frances could remember, her life had been with father, and the servants, and her governess. It had always seemed normal to Frances, safe, solid, and predictable, until now.